The sea on a winter's night has a way of muting the world. Above the surface, the half-moon hung pale in the sky, spreading a thin trail of silver across the Pacific swells. Each crest rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed eternal, indifferent to the great war raging across continents. There was no sound but the wind over the water, and even that came in whispers. To any sailor standing watch on the deck of a Japanese destroyer that night, it might have seemed peaceful, almost deceptively so. But beneath that shimmering skin of the ocean, a predator was waiting. The submarine was USS Archerfish, a Balao-class boat of the United States Navy. She was 311 feet of welded steel, painted in dull grey, her conning tower just a shadow against the moonlit sea when she surfaced, her periscope and radar antenna barely breaking the horizon when she submerged. Inside her pressure hull, the air was close and heavy, tinged with oil, sweat, and machinery. Men moved quietly around valves, gauges, and plotting tables, their voices hushed, their concentration absolute. They had been at war for years now, and yet, in this moment, something felt different. Something monumental was unfolding. At the center of it stood Commander Joseph F. Enright, a 33-year-old officer with dark eyes and a reputation that had been until recently uncertain. He had tasted failure before. On an earlier command, he had hesitated at crucial moments and returned from patrol without firing a single torpedo. To a submariner in wartime, such a patrol was more than disappointing, it was shameful. Enright had even requested to be relieved, feeling that his instincts had failed him. He carried that scar into every decision he made now. Tonight, in these black waters south of Honshu, he intended to redeem himself. Enright stood at the periscope, one hand resting lightly on the grip, the other fingering a rosary in his pocket. He was Catholic, and while not outwardly pious, he found comfort in that string of beads when responsibility weighed on him. And responsibility was heavy tonight. Somewhere to the north, beyond the headlands of Tokyo Bay, an enormous Japanese vessel was moving. The radar operator had called it out first, just a blip, 12 miles away, steady on a southwest course. The contact was large, unmistakably so, and Enright knew in his bones that this was no ordinary freighter. The question was, what was it? Archerfish had been assigned to lifeguard duty earlier in the evening, waiting to rescue downed American airmen from raids that never launched. Now free to roam, she had stumbled across a prize, though no one aboard yet knew its true magnitude. Enright's thoughts turned to the great Japanese battleships, the Yamato and Musashi, behemoths that had shaken the seas. Musashi had been sunk at Leyte Gulf just weeks earlier, hammered by waves of American bombers. Could Yamato herself be coming out, or was this something even stranger, something new? The submarine shuddered, slightly as she adjusted course. In the control room, men bent over the plotting board, tracing the lines of relative motion, adjusting bearings with grease pencils. They worked with quiet urgency, knowing that timing and geometry meant life or death. A mistake here would not only lose the target, but could invite destruction from the destroyers that certainly screened her. For now, though, Archerfish kept her distance, shadowing on the surface, using the darkness and the thin edge of cloud to hide her silhouette. Inside the submarine, life was tense but disciplined. The crew had long since learned to live in tight quarters. Torpedo men slept alongside their weapons in the forward room, officers shared bunks in shifts, and every man knew his station by instinct. The air carried a constant hum, fans, pumps, the low murmur of the diesels when surfaced. Men wore sweat-stained khakis, some stripped to undershirts in the muggy compartments. On nights like this, nerves heightened every sound. The creak of the hull as the sea pressed in, the slap of waves against the bow, the faint buzz of the radar screen. Each sound was magnified by expectation. And Enright was not about to let expectation become hesitation again. He had resolved that months earlier, when he sat across a poker table at Midway Naval Base. A senior officer had studied his aggressive bluffing and asked him, "Joe, would you command a submarine the way you play cards?" His answer had been simple. Yes. That answer had bought him another chance. Now, at the periscope, That chance was about to be tested. What Enright could not know yet was the scale of what lay before him. The ship he was stalking was Shinano, the pride of Japanese shipyards, and at 71,890 tons fully loaded, she was the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. She had been completed in secrecy, commissioned only days earlier, and sent into the night with skeleton training and unfinished systems. She was supposed to be a symbol of strength, of defiance. Instead, she was steaming unknowingly toward a single submarine, commanded by a man who needed redemption as badly as the Japanese Navy needed a miracle. The moon slipped briefly behind a veil of clouds, darkening the horizon. In that moment, the men aboard Archerfish felt the ocean grow even quieter, as though holding its breath. Enright leaned into the eyepiece once more. The silhouette was faint, but there, it loomed. He saw the escorts, darker smudges cutting through the water around the main vessel. A destroyer turned sharply, racing toward them, and for an instant it seemed the hunter had become the hunted. Then, inexplicably, the destroyer sheared off, wheeled back, and resumed station alongside its charge. The chance remained. Enright whispered to his officers, calm but firm, "Stay with her, let her zig, we'll find where she straightens out." His words carried not just orders, but a promise, to himself, to his men, to his career. He would not hesitate, this time. He would trust his instincts. He would strike. The clock ticked toward midnight. Somewhere ahead, the largest warship in history moved through the night, unaware that beneath the calm sea, a submarine and her determined captain had locked her in their sights. The stage was set. The game of patience, geometry, and fate had begun. The year was 1944, and the tide of the Second World War had turned, with a force that was now undeniable. For Japan, the empire that had once stretched from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma, the war was no longer about expansion, it was about survival. The empire stood on the defensive, battered from the air, strangled at sea, and bleeding in its outer island fortresses. The Pacific was no longer a vast moat protecting the Japanese home islands. It had become a battlefield that shrank with each passing month. American forces had leapt from island to island in relentless advance, the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, then the Marianas. Each step brought U.S. forces closer to Japan's heart. With every landing, the Japanese military was forced to fight from a weaker position, stretched thin, with resources dwindling and morale sinking. By the summer of 1944, the Philippines campaign had begun. General Douglas MacArthur, true to his famous promise, had returned. His troops were battling their way through Leyte and beyond, while Admiral Chester Nimitz directed the great fleets of the U.S. Pacific Navy in a steady march toward Okinawa. The oceans themselves had become hostile to Japanese shipping. Once the Imperial Navy had dominated those waters, but now it was American submarines that ruled beneath the waves. These silent service boats were proving devastatingly effective. Submarines like Archerfish had cut Japan's merchant fleet to ribbons. Tankers carrying oil from the East Indies were going down faster than they could be replaced. Cargo ships bringing food, weapons, and raw materials were easy, prey for submarines armed with patience and torpedoes. By 1944, Japan had lost more than half its merchant fleet, and the shortage was becoming crippling. Factories slowed, fuel ran short, and even basic supplies grew scarce. The mathematics of war had turned brutally against Japan. Where once the empire could replace losses in ships and aircraft, now each vessel sunk was irreplaceable. The great shipyards that had produced the fleet which struck Pearl Harbor were now struggling just to patch damaged vessels, let alone build new ones. Steel was scarce, skilled workers had been drafted into the military, and American bombing raids were beginning to target industrial centers. Above the waves, the situation was no better. The U.S. Navy had assembled the most powerful carrier strike groups ever seen. The fast carriers of the 3rd and 5th Fleets ranged freely across the Pacific, their aircraft pounding Japanese bases and striking the home islands themselves. The skies were no longer safe. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, with its immense range, had begun daylight raids against Japan's cities. Tokyo and Nagoya burned under their firestorms, and more raids were coming. The Imperial Navy, once the most modern and feared force in the Pacific, was now a pale reflection of its former glory. Its air arm had been decimated at Midway in 1942. Its battleships had been bloodied in the Solomons and the Marianas, and at the Great Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japan had thrown everything it had left into one last gamble. The result was disaster. Carriers like Suikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, were sunk. The mighty battleship Musashi was destroyed under relentless waves of American bombs and torpedoes. And though Yamato, the largest battleship afloat, had survived the encounter, she had been damaged and forced to retreat. The human cost was equally devastating. Japan's experienced pilots, the ones who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with such precision, were nearly all dead. Their replacements were hastily trained, often with less than 50 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. American pilots, by contrast, arrived at the front with hundreds of hours of training. The result was slaughter in the skies. Japanese aircraft were being shot down at ratios of 10-1, sometimes worse. Japan was running out of time, running out of ships, and running out of options. Yet even in this desperate situation, the nation clung to one last hope, that a powerful new weapon could shift the balance, if only for a time. That weapon was not another battleship or a new aircraft design. It was a ship unlike any the world had seen, a carrier so massive, so heavily armored and so secret that the Allies had no confirmation it even existed. Her name was Shinano, after the old Japanese province. Born from the hull of a Yamato-class battleship, she was meant to be untouchable, a fortress at sea. Japanese planners believed that if this carrier could be completed and put into action, she might anchor their defensive line around the home islands. Perhaps she could carry enough aircraft and special attack weapons to blunt the American advance, maybe even threaten the invasion fleets that were surely coming. The strategic thinking behind Shinano reflected Japan's evolving doctrine. No longer could the Imperial Navy dream of decisive battles where superior training and equipment would prevail. Instead, they needed a ship that could survive American air attacks, serve as a floating base for aircraft repair, and deliver the new suicide weapons that were becoming central to Japanese strategy. The Oka rocket-powered kamikaze planes and Shinyo explosive motorboats represented a grim calculation that Japanese lives could be traded for American ships at favorable ratios. But even as Japan built her, the realities of war pressed in. Shipyard workers toiled in shifts that stretched 16 hours or more. Materials were scarce, quality slipped, and deadlines loomed. Shinano's completion was rushed, so rushed that vital safety tests were skipped. The Empire needed the ship, and it needed her now. In Tokyo, leaders clung to illusions. If Shinano could steam with a full air group, she might bring down swarms of B-29 seconds. If she could sail to the Philippines, she might disrupt MacArthur's landings. If she could simply appear off Okinawa or Formosa, her mere presence might shake American confidence. The war was slipping away, but perhaps, just perhaps, one great ship could slow the inevitable. Yet desperation is no substitute for strength. Japan was already resorting to measures that betrayed how dire the situation had become. The kamikaze corps was not a sign of strength but of weakness, an admission that conventional warfare was no longer possible. Young pilots, some barely out of their teens, were being told that their highest service to the Emperor was to die ramming their aircraft into American ships. It was a strategy born of despair, dressed in the language of honor. The seas around Japan were no longer friendly. American submarines hunted the coasts relentlessly. Wolf packs of 3 or 4 boats would coordinate attacks on convoys, sinking escorts and merchantmen alike. In late November, as Shinano prepared to leave her shipyard, dozens of submarines lurked in the approaches to Tokyo Bay. They had divided the waters into patrol zones, each boat responsible for its sector, all reporting contacts to coordinate interceptions. Most would never know she existed, but one would, and that single encounter would decide her fate. The broader strategic picture was clear to any objective observer. Japan had lost the war. The only questions remaining were how long the fighting would continue and how many would die before the end. But for those caught in the machinery of war, the sailors, the shipbuilders, the pilots, such clarity was impossible. They continued to fight, to build, to hope, because the alternative was unthinkable. By November 1944, Japan was an empire under siege, its seas patrolled by unseen predators, its skies burned by firebombs, its cities trembling under the certainty of invasion. Into that storm sailed Shinano, a colossal ship, unready, untested, and carrying the burden of a nation's last hopes. And waiting for her, unseen in the night, was a submarine commanded by a man seeking redemption. Every great warship begins as a drawing on paper, lines on a blueprint that promise steel, power, and prestige. The story of Shinano began in just that way, but her destiny would change more than once before she ever touched salt water. She was conceived in 1940, at the height of Japanese naval ambition, as the third of the Yamato-class battleships. These were to be the largest, heaviest, most heavily armed battleships ever built, designed to outmatch anything afloat in the American or British fleets. Their armor was thicker, their guns larger, their displacement greater. They were symbols of an empire that sought dominance of the seas. The Yamato class represented a philosophy of naval warfare that dated back decades. Japanese strategic thinkers, aware that their nation could never match American industrial capacity, believed in qualitative superiority. If Japan could not build more ships than America, it would build better ships. Each Yamato-class battleship would be worth 2 or 3 of its American counterparts. Their 18.1-inch guns could strike targets at ranges where enemy vessels could not respond. Their armor could shrug off shells that would cripple lesser ships. 2 of her sisters were completed to that original design, Yamato and Musashi, each mounting 9 immense guns capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds farther and with more destructive power than any naval artillery before them. These shells could penetrate heavy armor at ranges exceeding 25 miles. Shinano's keel was laid down at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, one of the Empire's great shipyards, with every expectation that she would follow them into the Pacific as a floating fortress. The construction began with ceremony and pride. Shinto priests blessed the ground where she would rise. The emperor himself was informed of the project. The finest steel was allocated, the most experienced shipbuilders assigned. In the original plans, she would displace over 70,000 tons fully loaded, mount the same massive guns as her sisters, and cruise at 27 knots despite her enormous bulk. She represented not just a weapon, but a statement of Japanese technical prowess. But wars have a way of reshaping dreams. In June 1942, Japan suffered a devastating loss at the Battle of Midway. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost in a single day. Along with them went hundreds of experienced pilots and the backbone of Japan's naval air arm. That battle shifted the balance of power in the Pacific permanently. No longer could Japan rely on its carriers to project power as it had in the early triumphs of 1941 and 1942. The loss at Midway forced a fundamental reassessment of naval strategy. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, had proven to be the decisive weapons of modern naval warfare. The age of the big gun was ending. The age of the aircraft had arrived. The Navy's planners looked at Shinano's massive hull, still incomplete in her dock, and faced a choice. To finish her as a battleship meant to produce another gun platform in an era when carriers determined the outcome of war. To leave her unfinished was unthinkable. Too much had already been invested. The answer was clear. Shinano would be converted into an aircraft carrier. Not just any carrier, but the largest carrier the world had ever seen. The conversion was radical and complex. The lower hull, already shaped for a battleship's needs, had to be adapted for entirely different purposes. Her armoured citadel, originally designed to withstand enormous shellfire, was reconfigured to support an expansive hangar deck. Where gun turrets would have stood, aircraft elevators were installed. The superstructure was redesigned, shifted to starboard in the style of carriers. A flight deck, 840 feet long and about 130 feet wide, was constructed above everything else. Unlike other carriers, she would not be built primarily to launch vast offensive strikes. Instead, she was envisioned as a support carrier, a mobile fortress that could protect fleets with her armor, repair aircraft in battle, and carry suicide planes and motorboats designed for special attack missions. Her hangar could accommodate around 47 aircraft, with storage for many more in crates that could be assembled as needed. She would serve as a floating reserve, replenishing the air groups of other carriers that had suffered losses. This concept reflected the changing Japanese strategy. By 1944, Japan could no longer count on massing hundreds of trained pilots for conventional battles. The experienced aviators who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack were mostly dead. Their replacements were inadequately trained, often with less than 50 hours of flight time. Instead of conventional air power, Japan sought weapons of shock and desperation. Shinano would become their arsenal. The secrecy surrounding her construction was unprecedented. Fearing American bombers would destroy the ship before she ever sailed, the Navy took extraordinary measures. The dry dock where Shinano was being built was enclosed under a massive concrete roof, shielding her from prying eyes in the sky. This roof, supported by enormous steel girders, turned the construction site into a vast covered workshop. The workmen who toiled on her hull were confined within the yard. They lived in barracks on site, forbidden to leave or communicate with the outside world. They were threatened with prison, or worse, if they revealed a word of what they were building. Military police patrolled the perimeter. Not a single photograph of Shinano under construction was allowed to leave the yard. Even within the Imperial Navy, knowledge of Shinano was tightly controlled. Only a select few officers were permitted to know her specifications, documents referring to her used codenames. When she finally emerged, she would be a surprise not just to the Americans, but even to some of her own countrymen. This level of secrecy created its own problems. Suppliers delivering materials often didn't know what they were contributing to. Coordination between different departments suffered. Mistakes that might have been caught through normal oversight went unnoticed. Her design pushed the limits of naval engineering. With a full load displacement of 71,890 tons, Shinano dwarfed every other carrier afloat. Her armored flight deck, a rarity among carriers, could resist heavy bombs. Her armored belt, up to 8 inches thick at the waterline, gave her a level of protection unknown in carrier design. Her hangar was divided by heavy armored bulkheads, intended to prevent a single bomb or torpedo from crippling the entire ship. Her engines, 4 steam turbines producing 150,000 shaft horsepower, were designed to drive her at speeds of 27 knots, despite her massive bulk. The defensive armament was formidable. 165-inch dual-purpose guns in 8 twin mounts, capable of engaging both surface and air targets. Over 140 25mm anti-aircraft guns distributed across her hull, creating overlapping fields of fire, and 12 28-barrel rocket launchers that could fire salvos of explosive projectiles skyward, creating a curtain of steel against attacking aircraft. In theory, she would be nearly impossible for aircraft to approach, let alone successfully attack. Yet for all this grandeur, Shinano was being born into crisis. The workers building her were no longer the skilled craftsmen who had constructed Yamato and Musashi. Many experienced shipbuilders had been drafted into military service. Their replacements were conscripts, students, even prisoners of war. Quality control, once the pride of Japanese shipbuilding, deteriorated. Welds that should have been X-rayed for flaws were merely visually inspected. Tolerances that should have been measured in millimeters grew to centimeters. The pressure to complete her was relentless. Tokyo demanded she be ready by late 1944. Work continued around the clock. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were carried away, replaced immediately by others. The heat inside the covered dock in summer was stifling. In winter, workers' hands grew numb from cold. Accidents increased. Men fell from scaffolding, were crushed by moving steel plates, or were overcome by fumes from welding. Each death was hushed up, the war effort deemed more important than individual lives. Materials, too, were compromised. The special steel allocated for her armor was sometimes diverted to other urgent projects. Inferior substitutes were used. Electrical wiring, much of it imported before the war, was now irreplaceable. When supplies ran out, improvised solutions were implemented. Systems that should have been redundant became single points of failure. The great ship was being held together as much by determination as by engineering. Despite these challenges, she took shape. Month by month, her hull rose higher, her flight deck stretched toward completion, her island superstructure grew from the starboard side. To those who saw her, even incomplete, she was awesome. Workers would pause in their labor to simply stare at the immensity of what they were building. She was not just a ship, she was a floating city, a monument to human ambition. On the morning of the 8th of October 1944, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal stood braced for a moment of triumph. After 4 years of secret construction, Japan's greatest shipbuilding gamble was to touch the tide. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. This was to be more than a launch. It was to be a symbol of Japanese resilience, proof that even under bombardment and blockade, the empire could still create wonders. The day began with elaborate ceremony. At dawn, Shinto priests in white robes arrived to conduct purification rites. They waved streaming wands of white paper, chanted ancient prayers, and sprinkled salt to purify the ground. An altar was erected near the bow, offerings of rice, fish, and sake placed before it. The priests called upon the kami, the spirits of water, wind, and steel, to protect the vessel and grant her victory. High-ranking naval officers arrived in dress uniforms, their chests heavy with medals. Representatives from the imperial household were present. Workers, exhausted from years of labor, were given new clothes for the occasion. They stood in neat ranks, pride momentarily overcoming fatigue. Bands played martial music. Flags flew from every available point. The concrete roof that had hidden Shinano for so long had been partially removed, allowing shafts of sunlight to illuminate her hull. The launch plan was precise. Dry dock number 6 would be slowly flooded through controlled valves. As the water rose, Shinano would lift from her building blocks and float free. She would then be guided by tugs to a fitting-out pier where her final equipment would be installed. It was a procedure the shipyard had performed hundreds of times. What could go wrong? At 10:30 a.m., the order was given to begin flooding. Workers turned the valve wheels, and seawater began to flow into the dock. At first, everything proceeded normally. The water rose steadily, inch by inch, creeping up Shinano's hull. Spectators watched expectantly. Then, without warning, catastrophe struck. The caisson gate sealing dry dock number 6 from Tokyo Bay failed. The massive steel barrier designed to hold back the ocean gave way under the crushing pressure. Instead of a controlled flooding, a torrent of seawater burst inward with unstoppable force. The sound was like thunder, a roaring cascade that drowned out all other noise. In seconds, millions of gallons of water surged into the dock. Shinano, instead of rising gently, was hit by a wall of water. The massive ship surged forward like a cork blasted from a bottle, her tens of thousands of tons of steel driven by hydraulic force. She slammed into the dock's far wall with a grinding crash that seemed to shake the earth. The impact sent tremors through the shipyard. Windows shattered a quarter-mile away. Mooring cables, thick as a man's arm, snapped like threads. The recoil sent them whipping through the air with lethal force. One cable decapitated a worker, another crushed 3 men against a crane. The great hull rebounded from the impact and swung sideways, her stern smashing into the dock's side wall. She seesawed back and forth, a massive pendulum of destruction, crushing everything in her path. For long minutes, chaos reigned absolute. Workers fled in, panic, some diving into the churning water to escape the swinging hull. Others were swept away by the torrent. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar. The carefully choreographed ceremony had become a disaster. The band's instruments were scattered, flags torn away, the Shinto altar smashed to splinters. When the water finally stabilized and Shinano came to rest, the damage was surveyed. Miraculously, despite the violence, no fundamental structural damage had occurred to the ship herself. Her hull bore dents and scrapes, twisted fittings and broken railings, but her integrity remained. The human cost was another matter. 17 workers were dead, 43 injured. Some bodies were never recovered, swept out to sea or crushed beyond recognition. But perhaps the greatest damage was psychological. To the Japanese workers and sailors, ships were not mere machines. They possessed spirits, souls that needed to be properly honored. A ship whose launch was marked by disaster was considered cursed by the kami. The violent, uncontrolled launch was the worst possible omen. Word spread quickly through Yokosuka, then beyond. Whispers followed wherever Shinano's name was mentioned. She killed men before she even touched the sea. The ocean itself tried to reject her. The kami have turned their faces away. Captain Toshio Abe, newly appointed to command Shinano, tried to suppress such talk. A stern, practical officer who had survived Midway, he had no patience for superstition. In a speech to the crew, he dismissed the accident as meaningless. "Steel and engines have no spirit," he declared. "Discipline and training win battles, not omens." But even as he spoke, he could see doubt in his men's eyes. Sailors are superstitious by nature, and Japanese sailors especially so. Many made private offerings at shrines, seeking protection against the curse they believed clung to their ship. The repairs from the launch disaster were rushed, as everything about Shinano had become rushed. New plates were welded over damaged areas. Bent fittings were hammered straight or replaced. Paint covered the scars. Within 3 weeks, external evidence of the catastrophe had been erased, but those who had witnessed it could not forget. The image of that massive hull slamming back and forth, the screams of crushed workers, the sense that something fundamental had gone wrong, these memories persisted. Work resumed at an even more frantic pace. The November deadline loomed, and the accident had cost precious time. Safety procedures already compromised were further reduced. The watertight doors that should have been tested under pressure were merely checked to see if they closed. Electrical systems that should have been thoroughly inspected were given cursory reviews. The assumption seemed to be that if Shinano looked complete, she was complete. The crew assigned to her reflected this haste. Normally, a carrier's complement would train together for months before deployment. They would drill until every man knew not just his own job, but could fill in for others. Damage control, the art of saving a wounded ship, required particular expertise. Teams needed to work in perfect coordination, sealing compartments, manning pumps, fighting fires, all while potentially in darkness with the ship listing. But Shinano's crew was assembled from wherever men could be found. Veterans from sunken ships, new recruits fresh from training, workers conscripted from civilian life, they were thrown together with minimal organization. Many didn't even speak the same dialect of Japanese. The officers tried to conduct drills, but time was too short, the crew too green. When they practiced damage control procedures, confusion reigned. Men got lost in the maze of passages. Equipment was in the wrong places. Orders were misunderstood. Among the crew, talk of the curse persisted. Petty officers reported that men were requesting transfers, claiming illness, even injuring themselves to avoid sailing on Shinano. The ship's chaplain, a Buddhist priest, conducted blessing after blessing, trying to calm fears. But each ceremony seemed to emphasize the problem rather than solve it. Why did the ship need so many blessings if nothing was wrong? November arrived with urgency. The deadline was no longer approaching. It had arrived. Ready or not, Shinano had to sail. The American submarine threat grew worse each day. Intelligence reported dozens of enemy boats operating in Japanese waters. B-29 bombers were ranging farther from their bases in the Marianas. It was only a matter of time before they discovered and destroyed Shinano at her dock. The final weeks of preparation took on a desperate quality. Equipment that should have been carefully installed was literally thrown aboard. Crates of supplies were stacked wherever space could be found. The special weapons she was to carry, 50 Oka suicide rocket planes and several Shinyo explosive motorboats, were loaded into her hangars. These weapons, themselves symbols of Japan's desperation, seemed appropriate cargo for a desperate ship. On the 19th of November 1944, Shinano was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was subdued compared to the attempted grandeur of her launch. No bands played. Few dignitaries attended. Captain Abe read the official orders in a flat voice. The rising sun flag was raised on her mast. She was now officially a warship, though hardly a ready one. The commissioning revealed just how incomplete she was. Of her 12 boilers, only 8 were operational. This reduced her maximum speed from the designed 27 knots to about 20 knots. Her radar systems were only partially functional. Half of her anti-aircraft guns lacked adequate ammunition. The aircraft elevators that would lift planes from hangar to flight deck had never been tested under load. Most critically, many of her watertight doors, the barriers that could seal off flooded compartments, had never been tested under pressure. Captain Abe compiled a list of deficiencies that ran to 17 pages. He submitted it to Naval Headquarters with a request to delay sailing until at least critical repairs could be completed. The response was swift and uncompromising. Shinano would sail as scheduled. The naval staff's reasoning was political as much as military. Word of the supercarrier's existence was spreading. She needed to be revealed as a symbol of strength, not discovered as a bombed wreck. The sailing orders were specific. Shinano would depart Yokosuka on the night of November 28, steam south along the coast, and reach Kure Naval Base in the Inland Sea. There, protected from submarines by narrow straits and from bombers by distance, she would complete her fitting out. The voyage would take only about 20 hours. What could go wrong in 20 hours? The crew prepared with a mixture of pride and dread. They were sailing on the world's largest warship, a technological marvel. Yet they were also sailing on an unfinished ship with an untrained crew, many of whom believed her cursed. Last letters were written home. Personal effects were stowed. Some men visited Shinto shrines, leaving offerings and prayers. Others got drunk on sake, trying to drown their fears. The escort for the voyage was minimal, just 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze. All 3 were veterans of numerous battles, their crews experienced but their ships worn. Their radar and sonar systems, damaged in previous engagements, had been only partially repaired. They would have to rely more on lookouts than instruments. For protecting the world's largest carrier, it seemed inadequate, but every available destroyer was needed elsewhere. The night of the 28th of November, 1944, began with deceptive calm. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, the massive form of Shinano prepared for departure. Steam built in her boilers. Navigation lights flickered to life. On her bridge, Captain Abe reviewed the charts one final time. The route was straightforward, south along the coast, around the Izu Peninsula, then west to Kure. They would travel at night to avoid American bombers and stay close to shore to minimize exposure to submarines. At 6 p.m., Shinano's mooring lines were cast off. Tugs nudged her massive bulk away from the pier. Her screws began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering power. The great ship moved under her own power for the first time. Despite everything, the rushed construction, the cursed launch, the incomplete systems, she was magnificent. Her hull stretched nearly 900 feet. Her flight deck rose 60 feet above the water. She displaced more than most harbours could handle. She was, by any measure, an engineering triumph. The 3 destroyers took up their screening positions, Isokaze in the lead, Yukikaze and Hamakaze on the flanks. Together, the 4 ships headed for the harbour entrance and the open sea beyond. As they passed through the submarine nets protecting the harbour, several crew members noticed what they took as another bad omen, a dead albatross floating in the water, its white wings spread like a surrender flag. What none aboard knew was that to the south, USS Archerfish was beginning her patrol. The submarine had been on lifeguard duty, positioned to rescue American airmen from a bombing raid that had been cancelled due to weather. Now free to hunt, Commander Enright had brought his boat to the surface to recharge batteries and refresh the air. The night was perfect for submarine operations, dark enough to hide their low silhouette, calm enough for good sound conditions, with just enough moon to spot targets. At 8:48 p.m., Archerfish's radar operator called out, "Contact!" Bearing 020, range 12 miles. The blip on the radar screen was large, steady, and moving southwest at about 20 knots. Enright rushed to the bridge, raising his binoculars. On the horizon, barely visible, he could make out a dark mass and the smaller shapes of escorts. His pulse quickened. This was no merchant vessel. The size, the speed, the escorts, everything suggested a major warship. "Battle stations," Enright ordered quietly. Throughout the submarine, men moved to their positions with practiced efficiency. In the forward torpedo room, crews checked their weapons. In the control room, plotting teams prepared their charts and calculating boards. The hunt was on. Enright faced an immediate problem. The target was moving at 20 knots. Archerfish's maximum surface speed was just under 20 knots. In theory, the submarine couldn't catch her prey. But Enright knew that Japanese ships often zigzagged to avoid submarines, and those course changes would slow their advance. If he could anticipate the pattern, cut corners, he might be able to close the distance. For the next hour, Archerfish pursued at maximum speed, her 4 diesel engines straining. The submarine vibrated with the effort, her hull cutting through the swells, spray breaking over her bow. Below, engineers coaxed every possible revolution from the engines. The temperature in the engine room soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men worked in shifts, rushing topside to gulp fresh air before returning to their stations. On Shinano's bridge, radar operators and lookouts detected the American submarine not long after. The equipment might have been partially functional, but it worked well enough to spot a surface contact at several miles. Captain Abe received the report with grim satisfaction. He had expected submarines. The waters off Japan were infested with them, but he had plans to deal with this threat. "Signal the escorts," he ordered. "Enemy submarine, bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters." Abe's tactical situation was complex. His ship, despite her size, was vulnerable. She carried no aircraft to spot submarines. Her own sonar was not yet fully operational. She depended entirely on her escorts for protection, and he knew their capabilities were limited. The destroyer's sonar sets had been damaged in previous battles and repaired with inferior components. Their depth charge racks were only partially filled. Supplies were short everywhere. Moreover, Abe faced a dilemma. If he ordered the destroyers to pursue the submarine, they would have to leave Shinano's side, potentially exposing her to other submarines that might be lurking. American wolf packs often operated with one boat, revealing itself to draw off escorts while others moved in for the kill. But if he kept the destroyers close, the trailing submarine could shadow them, radioing their position to other boats or aircraft. Abe chose what seemed the prudent course. He would keep his escorts close and use speed and evasive maneuvers to shake off pursuit. "Execute zigzag pattern number 7, he ordered. The helm swung over, and Shinano's massive bulk began a series of course changes. 45 degrees to port, steady for 10 minutes. 60 degrees to starboard, steady for 8 minutes. Back to base course for 15 minutes. Then repeat. The zigzag was a standard anti-submarine tactic, but it had drawbacks. Each turn cost speed and distance. What should have been a 20-hour voyage would now take longer. Fuel consumption increased. And most critically, the pattern could be analyzed and predicted by an experienced submarine commander, which is exactly what Enright was doing. In Archerfish's control room, the plotting team tracked each of Shinano's course changes. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bobchinski, the executive officer, bent over the chart table, measuring angles and times. "She's following a standard pattern," he reported. "If we cut across her turns, We can gain distance. It became a deadly game of geometry. Shinano would turn away, opening the distance. Archerfish would cut the corner, closing it again. The submarine couldn't match the carrier's straight-line speed, but by taking shorter routes, she could keep pace. It required precise calculation and iron nerve. One miscalculation, and they would lose contact. One detection by the destroyers, and they would face a barrage of depth charges. As the chase continued into the night, Shinano's incomplete construction began to tell. At 11 p.m., a bearing on the starboard inboard propeller shaft began to overheat. The massive shaft, turning at high speed, generated friction that the bearing couldn't properly dissipate. Temperature gauges climbed into the red zone. The engineering officer faced a terrible choice: continue running and risk catastrophic failure, or slow down and perhaps fall prey to the submarine. He chose to reduce speed on that shaft. Shinano's speed dropped from 20 knots to 18. The reduction seemed small, but it was critical. Now, Archerfish could not just keep pace, but actually gain ground. On the submarine, the sonar operator reported the change in the target's sound. "She's slowing," he announced. Enright permitted himself a tight smile. The geometry of the hunt had shifted in his favor. But Shinano's troubles were just beginning. The rapid zigzagging, combined with her incomplete construction, stressed systems throughout the ship. Electrical connections, hastily installed, began to fail. Lights flickered in some compartments. Ventilation fans stopped. The temperature in the lower decks, already uncomfortable, became stifling. Men working in the engine rooms had to be rotated every 20 minutes to prevent heat exhaustion. More seriously, the constant course changes caused the ship to roll and flex in ways her incomplete structure wasn't prepared for. Seams that had been inadequately welded began to work open. Not enough to cause immediate flooding, but enough to allow seepage. Water began to accumulate in some of the lower compartments. Pumps were started to deal with it, but several pumps failed. They had never been properly tested, and now, under actual use, their defects became apparent. On the bridge, Captain Abe received report after report of mechanical issues. Each one was minor in itself, but collectively, they painted a picture of a ship coming apart under stress. He faced an agonizing decision. He could slow further, nursing his ship to port but making her an easier target, or he could maintain speed and risk more serious breakdowns. He chose a middle course, reducing speed to 16 knots and moderating the zigzag pattern. By 2 a.m. on November 29th, the deadly dance had continued for over 5 hours. Archerfish had closed to within 7,000 yards of her target, still too far for a torpedo attack, but close enough to maintain solid contact. The submarine's crew was exhausted but exhilarated. They could sense they were gaining on their prey. Enright studied the tracking data with intense concentration. Shinano's pattern was becoming clear. Despite the zigzags, she consistently returned to a base course of 210 degrees southwest toward Kure. If he could position Archerfish ahead of that track, if he could predict when she would steady on that course, he would have his shot. "Take her down to radar depth," he ordered. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, leaving only her radar mast above water. This reduced her speed but made her much harder to spot. Now she was truly a hunter in the darkness, invisible but watching. On Shinano, the mood was increasingly tense. The submarine had been trailing them for hours. Why hadn't it attacked? Why hadn't it been driven off? Some officers suggested it was calling in other boats, that they were being herded into a trap. American submarine tactics had evolved throughout the war. They were more aggressive now, more coordinated. At 2:56 a.m., fate intervened. Isokaze, the lead destroyer, spotted what her lookouts believed was a periscope off the starboard bow. Without waiting for orders, her captain increased speed and charged toward the contact. The destroyer's bow wave rose white in the darkness as she accelerated to 35 knots. On Archerfish, the sonar operator's voice rose in alarm. High-speed screws approaching, destroyer bearing 340, closing fast. Enright had seconds to decide: crash, dive, and probably lose his target forever, or hold his depth and risk detection. He chose to dive, but only to 150 feet, shallow enough to resurface quickly. "Rig for silent running. Rig for depth charge," he ordered. The destroyer passed directly overhead, her screws thundering through the water. Every man on Archerfish held his breath, waiting for the splash of depth charges. But none came. Isokazi had lost contact and, more importantly, had violated Captain Abe's orders to maintain formation. A sharp signal from Shinano's bridge ordered her back into position. The moment Isokazi turned away, Enright brought Archerfish back to periscope depth. Shinano was still there, still on course, now only 4,000 yards away. The opportunity he had waited for all night was at hand. At 3:15 a.m., everything aligned. Shinano steadied on her base course of 210 degrees. She was broadside to Archerfish, range 1,400 yards, speed 16 knots. In submarine warfare, it was the perfect setup, close enough for accuracy, angled for maximum target area, slow enough for a good solution. Enright made his final observations through the periscope. The carrier filled his view, massive beyond anything he had ever seen. Her flight deck stretched like a cliff face. Her island structure rose like a building. He could see lights in some of her portholes, the shadows of her escorts, the white water at her bow. He sketched quickly, recording her strange rounded bow, unlike any carrier in the recognition manuals. "Final bearing, and shoot," he ordered. "Make ready all tubes." In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were ready. These weapons had been troublesome earlier in the war, with defective detonators and depth control problems, but the issues had been largely fixed. Now they were reliable ship killers, each carrying 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. "Set depth 10 feet, Enright ordered. It was unusually shallow, but he remembered advice from a senior officer against carriers. Hit high on the hull where the damage would affect stability, not just cause flooding. The fire control party made their final calculations. Target speed, angle, distance, all were fed into the torpedo data computer, the analog brain that calculated the correct firing angle. The solution was checked and double-checked. There would be no second chance. "Fire one!" The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo left its tube. A blast of compressed air ejected the weapon, which immediately came to life, its propellers spinning, driving it toward the target at 46 knots. "Fire 2! 8 seconds between shots, giving each torpedo time to clear before the next launched. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. In less than a minute, 6 death sentences were racing through the water toward Shinano. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal, exactly as designed. Their wakes, barely visible in the darkness, drew converging white lines toward the carrier's hull. On Shinano's bridge, lookouts spotted the wakes too late. "Torpedo starboard!" came the cry. Captain Abe ordered full rudder, but the carrier's massive bulk responded slowly. She had barely begun her turn when the first torpedo struck. The explosion was tremendous. A column of water shot up alongside the hull, higher than the flight deck. The ship lurched to port from the impact. Before the crew could react, the second torpedo hit, then the third, then the fourth. 4 hits in less than 30 seconds, all on the starboard side, all between the bow and the island structure. The first torpedo struck near frame 104, close to an aviation fuel tank that was fortunately empty. The explosion tore a hole in the hull, flooding adjacent compartments instantly. The second hit farther aft, near the point where the starboard-outboard propeller shaft entered the hull. The blast flooded the outboard engine room, killing many of the men on watch. The third torpedo struck yet further aft, opening the number 3 boiler room to the sea and killing every man inside. The fourth hit near another fuel tank and adjacent machinery spaces, rupturing tanks and sending oil flooding through passages. For a moment, those on Shinano's bridge could barely comprehend what had happened. The ship shuddered with each impact, but she was so large that the torpedoes seemed almost insignificant. Captain Abe's first thought was that she could absorb this damage. After all, she had been built with a battleship's armor, designed to survive multiple torpedo hits. But below decks, catastrophe was unfolding. The incomplete construction that had plagued Shinano now became fatal, watertight. Doors that had never been properly tested failed immediately. Some jammed shut, trapping men in flooding compartments. Others refused to close at all. Seams that had been hastily welded split open under pressure. Electrical panels soaked with seawater short-circuited in showers of sparks. The damage control teams responded as best they could, but they were fighting a losing battle. The men had never drilled together as a unit. Orders were confused, contradictory. Some teams rushed to flood countervailing compartments on the port side to correct the list. Others tried to pump out flooded areas. The two efforts worked against each other. In the engine rooms, the situation was desperate. The starboard engine spaces were flooding rapidly. Engineers worked in rising water, trying to maintain power to the pumps. When water reached the electrical panels, explosions of sparks forced them to retreat. One by one, the starboard engines fell silent. The list increased steadily. 5 degrees, then 10, then 13. On the flight deck, aircraft and equipment began to slide. Sailors formed human chains, trying to secure loose items. A fuel truck broke free and crashed into the island structure. Boxes of ammunition tumbled into the sea. The ship was still moving, still under command, but she was wounded to the core. Back on Archerfish, Enright had taken the submarine deep immediately after firing. Now came the most dangerous moment for any submarine, the counterattack. "Take her to 400 feet, he ordered. "Rig for silent running." Archerfish descended into the black water, every man aboard listening to the sounds above. The sonar headphones crackled with the high-pitched whine of destroyer screws. Then came the sharp metallic pings of active sonar, probing the depths. The first pattern of depth charges splashed into the sea, then sank in eerie silence before detonating. 5 explosions boomed in succession. The submarine shook, light bulbs shattered, cork insulation rained from the overhead, but the concussions were distant, unpleasant, not lethal. More depth charges followed, 14 in all. Each pattern crept closer, shock waves hammering the hull, gauges trembling, coffee cups dancing on tables. Men gripped whatever was bolted down and waited, but none of the blasts were close enough to cause serious damage. The Japanese sonar, damaged and poorly maintained, could not get a precise fix on the submarine. After an hour, the sounds above grew more distant. The destroyers were turning back to their wounded charge. When Enright finally brought Archerfish back to periscope depth at dawn, the horizon was empty. Whatever had happened to the giant carrier, she was gone from sight. As dawn broke on November 29th, Shinano was in her death throes. The list had increased to 20 degrees. Walking on the tilted decks was becoming impossible. Men used ropes to pull themselves up the slanted surfaces. In the hangar deck, the Oka suicide, planes had broken loose, sliding into each other, their volatile rocket fuel turning the crowded space into a fire hazard. The flooding had spread far beyond the initial torpedo damage. This was the phenomenon naval architects called progressive flooding water, finding paths through doors, vents, cable runs, any opening, spreading like cancer through the ship. Compartments that should have been safe were filling. The weight of water, thousands of tons of it, was dragging Shinano deeper by the bow and over onto her starboard side. Captain Abe made one last determined attempt to save his ship. He ordered all engines ahead full, trying to drive Shinano toward land and shallow water. But with only the port engines functioning, the carrier could barely make 10 knots. The uneven thrust made steering difficult. She was wallowing, not running. Course was set toward the nearest coast, the rocky headlands of the Key Peninsula. If he could beach the ship, he might yet save her from sinking. Messages went out to naval headquarters. Shinano torpedoed, attempting to reach shore. Below decks, scenes of heroism and tragedy played out. Engineers remained at their posts in the flooding machinery spaces, keeping the lights on and the pumps running until water drove them out. Medical officers worked in tilting sick bays, trying to evacuate patients up slanting ladders. In one flooded compartment, Dozens of men were trapped behind a jammed hatch. Their hammering could be heard for an hour before it stopped. The list continued to worsen. 20 degrees, 25. On the flight deck, equipment and men slid toward the low side. Sailors tried to lash down whatever they could, but each minute the angle grew steeper. A single misstep could send a man skidding into the sea or below through gaping openings. At about 8:30, Abe authorized an emergency signal warning nearby forces that Shinano might have to be abandoned. It was not yet an order to leave the ship, but it acknowledged the gravity of her condition. Sailors began gathering on the higher side of the flight deck, helping wounded comrades up from below. Life jackets were distributed where they could be found. The three destroyers moved in closer, preparing to pick up survivors if it came to that. Below decks, damage control officers fought numbers they could no longer beat. Flooding reports came in faster than they could be plotted. Compartments that had been marked as controlled were flooding again as water found new pathways. Pumps were overwhelmed or failed outright. The tilt of the ship made movement through passageways hazardous. Men stumbled, fell, or were crushed by shifting equipment. By 9, Shinano had lost all power. The great ship lay dead in the water, her list increasing past 20 degrees. Without power, pumps were useless. Lighting failed in many compartments, plunging men already struggling in rising water into darkness. On the flight deck, the angle of the world had become surreal. The deck felt less like a ship and more like a collapsing hillside. Men clung to railings, winches, anything that protruded from the steel. Some prayed, some cursed. Others stared silently at the horizon, faces grey with exhaustion and fear. At 10:18, Abe released the crew to save themselves. He refused to give the explicit command to abandon ship tradition, and personal pride would not allow it, but the meaning was clear. Those who could get off should. The list passed 30 degrees. Equipment, aircraft, and men began sliding uncontrollably down the flight deck into the sea. Some sailors jumped, hurling themselves from a height of nearly 60 feet. Many were killed on impact with the water or stunned and unable to swim. Others tried to climb uphill toward the high side of the ship, only to lose their grip and tumble back. The destroyers closed in, their crews throwing lines and scrambling nets over the side. Captain Abe remained on the bridge. As was tradition, he would go down with his ship. He tied himself to the helm, determined to maintain dignity to the end. Around him, his senior officers made the same choice. Accounts from survivors later told of officers on the bridge singing the national anthem as the water rose around them. At 10:57, Shinano finally capsized. Her enormous hull rolled ponderously, the flight deck tilting past vertical. For a moment, the massive red underside of the ship was visible, streaked with anti-fouling paint and scarred metal. Then she went under, stern first, with a tremendous roar of escaping air and collapsing steel. Bubbles, oil, and debris boiled to the surface. In seconds, the largest aircraft carrier in the world was gone, swallowed by 4,000 meters of dark water off the Kii Peninsula. 17 hours after she left Yokosuka, her brief life at sea was over. The sea where Shinano sank was littered with debris and desperate men. Over 2,500 people had been aboard: sailors, officers, yard, workers, civilians. Now hundreds struggled in the oil-slicked water. The three destroyers moved among them, picking up survivors where they could. But the rescue was imperfect, shaped by wartime attitudes and limited capacity. Naval tradition held that officers should be saved first. Some destroyer captains, hardened by years of war, refused to pick up men who appeared panicked, shouting to their crews, "Save only the brave." The result was tragedy upon tragedy. Men who had survived the sinking drowned within sight of rescue ships. Others, covered in oil, were too slippery to hold and slipped beneath the waves when hands lost their grip. The winter sea was cold. Hypothermia claimed those who weren't picked up quickly. When the rescue ended, 1,080 men had been saved: officers, enlisted sailors, and a handful of civilians. The remaining 1,435, including Captain Abe and most of his senior officers, were dead. It was one of the largest losses of life in a single ship sinking during the Pacific War. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic, but had to be hidden. Shinano had been a state secret. Her loss would remain one. Survivors were sworn to silence. Families of the dead were told only that their loved ones had died in action, not where or how. The official records were sealed. To the Japanese public, Shinano had never existed. But secrets are hard to keep in war. American code breakers, reading intercepted messages, learned of the sinking within days. The name Shinano appeared in decoded traffic, along with her position when torpedoed. Intelligence officers were puzzled. They had no record of a carrier by that name. What had Archerfish sunk? When Enright filed his patrol report in December, claiming to have sunk a carrier of unprecedented size, he was met with skepticism. Navy intelligence insisted no such carrier existed. The highest they would credit him with was a 28,000-ton carrier of an assumed class and name, still significant but far short of reality. Only after the war, when American investigators gained access to Japanese records, was the truth revealed. Shinano had displaced over 70,000 tons fully loaded. She was indeed the largest carrier ever built at that time, and remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Enright's instincts had been correct. His redemption was complete. The story of Shinano's single voyage carries lessons that transcend the specific events of November 1944. It is a tale of hubris and humility, of grand ambitions undone by fundamental flaws, of how the smallest predator can fell the mightiest prey if conditions align. For Japan, Shinano represented the failure of the decisive weapon philosophy. Throughout the war, Japanese strategists had sought single war-winning weapons, super battleships, divine wind attacks, miraculous carriers. But wars are won by systems, not symbols. While Japan built one massive carrier, America built dozens of smaller ones. While Japan rushed incomplete ships to sea, America took time to train crews properly, to test systems, to refine procedures. The result was inevitable. The technical lessons were equally clear. Size without reliability is vulnerability. Armor without proper damage control is false security. A ship's strength lies not just in steel, but in the training of her crew, the quality of her construction, the integrity of every weld and seal. Shinano failed not because her basic design was inherently impossible, but because her execution was incomplete. Watertight doors that had never been tested. Pumps that failed when first truly needed. Electrical systems improvised under pressure. A crew that had never drilled together in realistic conditions. On paper, she was a fortress at sea. In reality, she was a half-finished experiment pushed into combat by desperation. For the submarine force, the sinking validated their war of attrition. Submarines, relatively cheap and crewed by fewer than 100 men, could destroy capital ships worth thousands of times their cost. The silent service had proven it could strike anywhere, anytime, against any target. The age of the submarine as a strategic weapon had truly arrived. Commander Enright's personal journey, from failure to redemption, resonated throughout the Navy. His story showed that one failure need not define a career, that persistence and courage could overcome past mistakes. He had faced his demons and emerged victorious. The Navy Cross he received was not just for sinking Shinano, but for the determination to stay in the fight after earlier defeats. The human cost haunts the story. Over 1,400 Japanese sailors died, many of them conscripts who had never wanted to go to war. They died trapped in flooding compartments, thrown from tilting decks, or abandoned in cold water. Their sacrifice achieved nothing in strategic terms. Shinano never launched a plane in anger, never defended the homeland, never justified the resources spent on her construction. Somewhere in deep water off the Kii Peninsula, Shinano rests as a tomb for the men who died with her, and as a monument to the age when nations believed that bigger meant better, that one perfect weapon could change everything. Modern naval strategists study Shinano as a cautionary tale. In an age of nuclear carriers and ballistic missile submarines, the lessons remain relevant. Complexity requires competence. size demands support. No ship, no matter how powerful, is stronger than the system that builds, maintains, and operates it. The sinking also demonstrates the role of chance in war. Had Shinano sailed a day earlier or later, had Archerfish been assigned elsewhere, had the torpedoes run deep instead of shallow, history would be different. War is not just strategy and technology, but also luck and timing. On that November night in 1944, all the variables aligned perfectly for Archerfish and catastrophically for Shinano. In the years after the war, the story of Shinano and Archerfish became legend in naval circles. Authors wrote books, historians analyzed the engagement, veterans shared their memories. Each telling added details, corrected errors, built the narrative that we know today. Commander Enright went on to a successful naval career, eventually retiring as a captain. He rarely spoke publicly about the sinking, maintaining the quiet professionalism of the submarine service. When asked about that night, he would say simply, "We did our duty. The torpedoes worked. We were lucky." But those who knew him understood that it meant everything: the vindication of his courage, the proof that he belonged in command, the second chance that he had seized. The crew of Archerfish held reunions for decades. They would gather, these aging men who had once been young sailors, and remember their moment of glory. They told stories of the long chase, the tension of the approach, the thunder of the torpedoes hitting home. But they also remembered Shinano's crew, fellow sailors who had died doing their duty. War had made them enemies. Time made them all simply men who had served at sea. Some survivors of Shinano also told their stories after the veil of secrecy finally lifted. They spoke of the chaos, the fear, the sight of their mighty ship rolling over and sinking. They remembered Captain Abe's final moments, standing at attention as the water rose. They remembered comrades who had helped them escape flooding compartments, who had given up life jackets, who had pushed others to safety before being pulled under themselves. In Japan, Shinano became a symbol of the war's last phase, grand gestures that achieved nothing, magnificent failures that only added to the suffering. She represented the danger of believing one's own propaganda, of confusing appearance with reality, of rushing toward disaster rather than accepting defeat. For America, the sinking reinforced the democratic nature of naval warfare, that some 80 men in a submarine could defeat thousands in a carrier, that patience and skill could overcome size and armor. It was David and Goliath written in steel and torpedoes, proof that in war, the smallest unit could achieve strategic victory. Today, Shinano rests in nearly 4,000 meters of water off the Key Peninsula. Somewhere down there on the slope of the seabed lies the largest aircraft carrier of her time, slowly yielding to pressure and time. She is a tomb for the men who died with her, and a monument to the age when nations believed that bigger meant better, that one perfect weapon could change everything. Modern naval strategists study Shinano as a cautionary tale. In an age of nuclear supercarriers and ballistic missile submarines, the lessons remain relevant. Complexity requires competence, size demands support. No ship, no matter how powerful, is stronger than the system that builds, maintains, and operates it. Her story underscores a simple truth. Design brilliance cannot compensate for rushed construction, inadequate testing, and untrained crews. Shinano went to sea with untested, watertight integrity, incomplete damage control systems, and a crew that had never truly drilled together. On paper, she was a fortress. In practice, she was vulnerable in ways no thickness of armor could fix. The sinking also demonstrates the role of chance in war. Had Shinano sailed a day earlier or later, had Archerfish been kept on lifeguard duty elsewhere, had the torpedoes run deep instead of shallow, history would be different. War is not just strategy and technology, but also luck and timing. On that November night in 1944, all the variables aligned perfectly for Archerfish and catastrophically for Shinano. In the years after the war, the story of Shinano and Archerfish became legend in naval circles. Authors wrote books, historians analyzed the engagement, veterans shared their memories, each telling added details, corrected errors, and gradually built the narrative that we know today. For officers and planners, Shinano's fate became a case study in what happens when strategic desperation overrules technical prudence. For shipbuilders, it was a reminder that every weld, every seal, every overlooked test can become the margin between survival and catastrophe. For submariners, Archerfish's patrol became proof that patience, geometry, and discipline could topple even the mightiest target. Yet beneath all the analysis, the human element remains. The men of Shinano and the men of Archerfish were not abstractions. They were sailors who lived and worked and worried and hoped. On one side, a crew sailing a ship they half believed was cursed, trying to do their duty on an unfinished giant. On the other, a crew chasing redemption for their captain, trusting their training and their instincts in the darkness. In Japan, Shinano came to symbolize the war's final phase, grand gestures that achieved nothing, magnificent failures that only added to the company, suffering. She represented the danger of believing one's own propaganda, of confusing appearance with reality, of rushing toward disaster rather than accepting defeat. For America, the sinking reinforced the democratic nature of naval warfare, that a single submarine, crewed by fewer than 100 men, could defeat a warship carrying thousands, that patience and skill could overcome size and armor. It was David and Goliath, written in steel and torpedoes, a reminder that in war, the smallest unit can sometimes achieve strategic victory. Today, as nations again compete to build the largest, most powerful warships, Shinano's story remains relevant. Technology advances, but the human factors that doomed her persist. Ships are still built in haste. Crews still sometimes sail with insufficient training. Leaders still occasionally indulge the fantasy that one supreme weapon can change everything. The ghost of Shinano warns against such hubris. The final lesson may be the most universal, that in war, as in life, the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Sometimes patience defeats power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Sometimes a single night's action can echo through history, teaching generations yet unborn about courage, folly, and the thin margin between victory and disaster. On that November night in 1944, two ships met in the darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest of her kind ever built. The other was a standard submarine of no special distinction in outward appearance. When the sun rose, only one remained. That is the nature of war at sea, sudden, decisive, final. The ocean shows no favoritism to size or strength. It swallows all equally, keeping its secrets in the dark depths where Shinano rests still, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a giant felled by a predator she never truly saw.